The world was the color of rust and regret. A gritty, red dust, whipped into a frenzy by a merciless wind, scoured the land, turning the vast emptiness of the border territories into a churning sea of ochre. It clogged the throat, stung the eyes, and settled like a shroud on everything, man and beast alike. Silas Boone tasted it on his teeth, a permanent grit that was as much a part of him now as the ache in his bones. His horse, a muscular roan named Balthazar, plodded onward with the grim determination of an animal that knew its rider would not allow it to stop. The beast's head was low, its breath coming in ragged, dusty bursts, a dark, wet stain, almost black against the horse's reddish-brown coat, marred the leather of the saddle just behind Silas's left leg. It wasn't the horse's blood. It was his. The bullet had torn through the meat of his shoulder hours ago. A lifetime ago. Back in the haze of smoke and shouts and the deafening roar of gunfire that had erupted in a dusty cantina just south of the line. It had been a stupid fight over a card game he hadn't even been playing. A spray of misaimed lead meant for someone else. Or maybe it was meant for him. He couldn't be sure. Anymore. It seemed every bullet in this godforsaken land had his name etched on it somewhere. He'd torn a strip from his own shirt to stuff into the wound. A clumsy, desperate plug that was already soaked through. A dull, grinding ache radiated from his shoulder down his arm. A constant, throbbing reminder of his own mortality. But the pain was a distant thing, a low hum beneath the louder silence in his soul. He wasn't running from the law. The local sheriff, if there even was one in that miserable scrap of a town, would have his hands full just counting the bodies. Silas wasn't running from the men who had shot him, either. He had returned fire with the cold, detached efficiency of a man who had nothing to gain from living and nothing to fear from dying. He was certain at least one of them wouldn't be getting up again. No, Silas Boone wasn't running from fear. Fear was a luxury he had lost the right to feel 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days ago. He was running because the alternative was to stand still. And to stand still was to let the memories catch him. And the memories were far more dangerous than any bullet. He was running because there was no place to go back to. Home was a word that had been burned out of his vocabulary, reduced to ash and smoke on a windy night in the Texas Panhandle. He had been a rancher then, a man with calloused hands from mending fences, not from gripping the butt of a Colt. He'd had a wife, Sarah, whose laughter was the only music he'd ever needed, and a son, Jacob, a little boy with his mother's bright eyes and a fascination with the horned toads that scurried in the dust. They were his world, his sun, his moon, his entire sky. Then came the accusation, a lie whispered on the wind about stolen cattle, a lie that grew into a grudge held by a man with more power than sense. Silas had been away, selling horses in a town 2 days' ride east. He came back to a sky black with smoke and a silence that screamed louder than any fire. They hadn't just taken his life. They had torched the very ground it was built on. He found what was left of his world in the smoldering ruins of the house he had built with his own 2 hands. He buried them himself, under the lone cottonwood by the dried-up creek, his hands raw and bleeding, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. The man who rode away from those 2 small graves was not the same man who had ridden out a week earlier. The laughter was gone, replaced by a permanent squint against the sun and the wickedness of men. He tracked down the ones responsible, not with the fire of vengeance, but with the cold, methodical purpose of a man tidying up a messy world. There was no satisfaction in it, no peace, just a series of loud noises and then more silence, an emptier silence. Since then, he had drifted. He took jobs where he could find them busting broncos, guarding payrolls, riding shotgun on stages that rattled through hostile territory. He never stayed in one place long enough for the dust to settle around his boots. He spoke little, drank alone, and slept with his gun under his hand. He was a ghost, haunting the sun-scorched plains, a man without a destination, a man who had nothing left to lose. The dust storm began to relent as he rode into a forest of skeletal yucca plants, their spiky arms reaching for the sky like desperate prophets. The wind died down to a low moan, and the air cleared enough for the merciless sun to beat down again, turning the dampness of his bloody shirt into a sticky, uncomfortable plaster against his skin. The world resolved itself back into harsh lines and sharp shadows. Bleached rocks littered the ground between the yuccas, the bones of the earth itself. It was then he saw it, a flicker of white against the dull brown of a massive granite boulder. His body tensed instantly. His right hand, as if with a mind of its own, moved to rest on the worn wooden handle of his revolver. In this land, the unexpected was almost always a threat. White could be a flag of truce, or it could be the flash of a shirt before an ambush. He drew Balthazar to a slow, silent walk. His eyes narrowed, scanning the landscape for any other sign of movement. The horse, sensing the shift in his rider, moved with a newfound caution, its ears twitching. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It wasn't a flag. It was a person, huddled in the sliver of shade offered by the overhanging rock. A woman, and the white was a dress. Silas halted his horse about 20 yards away, his hand still resting on his gun. He sat in the saddle, a statue of dusty leather and suspicion, and watched. The woman was small, a fragile-looking thing to be out here alone. Her shoulders were shaking, but not violently. It was a fine, steady tremor, the kind that comes from deep cold or profound exhaustion. Her head was bowed, her face hidden by a cascade of dark hair that had come loose from whatever pins had once held it. The dress was the strangest part, even caked with dust and grime along the hem. It was unmistakably a wedding dress. It was simple, made of plain white cotton without lace or frills, the kind a farmer's daughter might wear, but it was a wedding dress nonetheless, a stark and bewildering sight in the middle of this unforgiving wilderness. He nudged Balthazar forward, one slow step at a time, the creak of his saddle leather unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness. He stopped a few feet from her. He could see her more clearly now. Her shoes, delicate things meant for a church aisle, were torn and scuffed, the thin soles worn through in places. Her hands were clenched in the fabric of her skirt, her knuckles white. He cleared his throat. The sound was a rough, dry rasp. "Ma'am!" Her head snapped up, and for the first time, Silas felt something other than the dull ache of his wound or the hollow echo of his past. It was a jolt of surprise. He had expected to see terror, to see a face pleading for help. He saw neither. Her eyes were swollen and red-rimmed from crying. No doubt about that. Tear tracks had cut clean paths through the dust on her cheeks, but the eyes themselves, a deep, startling blue, held a look of fierce, stubborn pride. They were the eyes of a cornered animal. Yes, but one that was ready to fight, not to surrender. She looked at him, taking in his blood-stained shirt, the gun on his hip, the hard, weathered lines of his face, and she did not flinch. Her chin, smudged with dirt, was lifted in a gesture of pure defiance. She didn't speak. She just watched him, her breath held tight in her chest. The tremors in her body continued, but her gaze was rock steady. Silas let his hand fall away from his gun. An ambush was one thing. This was something else entirely. This was a puzzle, and he was too damn tired for puzzles. Still, he couldn't just ride on. To leave a woman, any woman, out here alone was a death sentence. Coyotes, exposure, or worse. The two-legged predators were far more dangerous than the four-legged kind. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was gravelly from disuse. She gave a single, sharp shake of her head. Not lost. That meant she was either going somewhere or running from something, judging by the dress and the tears. He wagered it was the latter. He looked at her torn shoes, the exhaustion etched into the pale skin around her eyes, the way her whole body was coiled like a spring. She'd been running hard. He sighed, the sound a soft exhalation of dust and weariness. He swung his good leg over the saddle and dismounted, his boots landing softly in the sandy soil. The movement sent a fresh spike of fire through his shoulder, and he gritted his teeth against a grimace. He walked over to his saddlebag, unstrapped his canteen, and walked back towards her, holding it out. "Water." She stared at the canteen for a long moment, then back at his face. Her throat worked as she swallowed, the movement visible in her slender neck. He could see the war in her eyes, the desperate need versus the fierce refusal to accept help, to show weakness. Finally, pride lost to thirst. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the canteen. Her fingers brushed his, and her skin was cold, despite the baking heat. She fumbled with the cap before finally getting it open and drinking, not greedily, but in slow, measured swallows, as if her throat had forgotten how. When she was done, she carefully screwed the cap back on and held it out for him. Their eyes met again over the metal flask. He saw her properly then, not just as a shape in a white dress, but as a person. She was young, barely out of her girlhood, but there was an oldness in her eyes, a shadow of hardship that didn't belong on a face so young. "My name is Mercy," she said. Her voice was quiet, a little hoarse, but clear. It held no plea, no hint of a question. It was a simple statement of fact, offered into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. Silas took the canteen and nodded slowly, the name echoing strangely in the barren landscape of his mind. Mercy, it was a name for a prayer, a soft word for a hard world. He hadn't known any for a long, long time, and looking at the girl in the tattered wedding dress, with defiance burning in her tear-stained eyes, he had a feeling she hadn't either. Silas attached the canteen back to his saddle, the simple metallic click echoing in the profound stillness. He did not offer his own name in return. Names were anchors, ties to a past and a place, and he had cut all his moorings long ago. He was just a man, passing through. The name Mercy, however, lingered in the air between them, a fragile, unlikely thing in a land that offered none. He looked from her face to the vast, empty horizon that stretched out behind her, the direction from which she must have come. There was nothing there but dust and distance. She followed his gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the hard shell of her composure cracked. A flicker of raw terror, potent and pure, widened her blue eyes before she clamped down on it, her jaw tightening. She looked back at him, her expression once again a mask of weary resolve. It was the look of a person who had run so far and so fast that stopping was the most frightening thing imaginable. "I am not running because I'm scared," she said, her voice low but steady, as if trying to convince herself as much as him. "There's just no place left to go." The words hung between them, resonating with a truth so deep within him that it was like a physical blow. He understood that sentiment better than his own heartbeat. It was the creed of the lost, the anthem of the damned. He wasn't afraid either. He was just empty. Looking at her, he saw a different kind of emptiness, not one carved out by loss, but one hollowed out by the absence of hope. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't ask what she was running from. A man in a blood-soaked shirt didn't have the right to question the troubles of others. And in this territory, a person's past was their own private burden to carry. Asking about it was like asking to carry its weight, and Silas was already carrying more than any man should bear. He turned back to his horse, his movement stiff from the wound in his shoulder. Every instinct screamed at him to get back on Balthazar and ride away. She was not his problem. She was a complication, a magnet for whatever trouble she was fleeing. He had learned the hard way that entanglements led to pain, that caring for anything gave the world a target to aim at. His life, such as it was, depended on being a ghost, a shadow that left no impression on the world it passed through. This girl, in her impossible white dress, was the very opposite of a shadow. She was a beacon. He put his boot in the stirrup, his muscles groaning in protest. He could give her the rest of the water in his canteen, maybe the jerky in his saddlebag. That would be more than most would do. That would be enough. He could ride north, and by morning, she would be nothing but a strange, dusty memory. "Sir," her voice stopped him. It was quiet, hesitant, but it cut through the hum of his own bleak thoughts. He turned his head just enough to see her out of the corner of his eye. She had taken a small step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Which way are you headed?" she asked. "North," he grunted, the word clipped and final. She was silent for a long moment. He could feel her gaze on his back, could practically hear the desperate calculation in her mind. When she spoke again, her voice was stripped of everything but raw need. Could I ride with you just for a little ways? I won't be any trouble." He closed his eyes. Trouble. She was already trouble, but the image of her, alone and shivering under that rock as the sun went down, rose unbidden in his mind. He thought of the coyotes whose yips and howls would soon replace the silence of the day. He thought of other men without a shred of decency, who might ride this same trail, and then a ghost of a memory, faint and painful, surfaced his Sarah, her face beaming as she helped a neighbor's wife whose wagon had lost a wheel, saying, "You don't leave people behind out here. The land will take them if you do." That memory was a hot poker to his soul. He hated it. He hated the man he used to be, the man who believed in such things. But the ghost of that man was still there, buried deep, and it would not let him go. With a sigh that was more of a growl, he turned fully to face her. "I'm not heading to any town. I'm not heading anywhere in particular." "Neither am I," she answered, her blue eyes locking onto his. "Anywhere is better than here." He stared at her for a long time, his face an unreadable mask of dust and pain. He saw her unwavering gaze, the tremor in her hands that she was trying so hard to hide. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask where he got the blood on his shirt. She didn't ask what he was doing out here alone. She just accepted him for what he was, a man on a horse, pointing north, in her desperate pragmatism. There was a strange kind of respect for the unspoken code of the West, a code he lived by. You don't ask questions you don't want to answer yourself. "All right," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He gestured with his head towards the horse. "Get on." Relief washed over her face, so profound it was like watching a parched plant receive water. But she recovered quickly, her pride reasserting itself. She simply nodded, a quick, grateful dip of her chin. The logistics were awkward. She was in a dress, and Balthazar was a tall horse. Silas, with his useless left arm, could only offer so much help. He stood by the horse's side, his good hand steadying the stirrup. "You'll have to ride behind." She gathered the dusty white skirt in her hands and, with a grim determination that he was beginning to recognize as a core part of her, she managed to get her torn shoe into the stirrup and pull herself up. It was clumsy and graceless, but she did it. She settled herself behind the saddle, her skirts arranged as best she could over the horse's broad back. Silas mounted in front of her, a jolt of agony shooting through his shoulder as he swung his leg over. He bit back a curse, his body rigid for a moment as the wave of pain washed over him. When he settled into the worn leather, he was acutely aware of her presence behind him. The space between them was barely a few inches. He could feel the slight, hesitant warmth of her legs against the back of his thighs. "Hold on to the saddle horn, or my belt," he instructed, his voice rougher than he intended. "Don't hold on to me." "I won't," she whispered. He felt a slight shift as she found her balance, her hands lightly gripping the high cantle of his saddle. He clicked his tongue, and Balthazar, with a weary snort, resumed his journey north. The silence that fell then was of a different quality than before. It was heavier, denser, filled with the presence of another human being. It was a silence measured by the rhythmic plod of Balthazar's hooves on the hard-packed earth and the constant, soft creak of saddle leather. The world stretched out before them, a panorama of red rock and thorny scrub under a sky that was slowly deepening from a harsh, bleached blue to a softer violet at the edges. Silas rode with his shoulders hunched, his body a fortress of solitude she had somehow breached. He tried to retreat back into the familiar emptiness of his own mind, to the cold, quiet place where his ghosts lived. But he couldn't. Her presence was a constant, undeniable reality at his back. He was aware of every shift of her weight, every soft rustle of her cotton dress. He could even smell her, a faint scent beneath the dust and sweat, something clean and simple like soap and sunlight, a scent from a world he no longer inhabited. He did not know how long they rode. An hour, 2. The sun sank lower, painting the western clouds in fiery strokes of orange and crimson. The heat of the day began to bleed out of the air, replaced by the creeping chill of the desert night. The shadows of the yuccas grew long and grotesque, like skeletal fingers stretching across the trail. It was the cold that he noticed first, or rather, her reaction to it. He felt a tremor run through her body, a slight vibration that traveled through the saddle into his own back. He ignored it at first. Nerves, he figured. The girl was likely terrified, riding into the unknown with a wounded stranger. He couldn't blame her. But the trembling didn't stop. As the last of the sun's warmth vanished and a pale, luminous moon began to rise, it became more pronounced. It was a fine, steady shiver now, a constant, rhythmic juddering. He felt it against his back, a persistent reminder of the small, fragile person clinging to the back of his saddle. He thought again that it was fear of the dark, of the strange, lonely sounds of the night that were beginning to rise around them, the distant howl of a lone coyote, the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. The thought irritated him. He didn't have the time or the energy to soothe a frightened girl. But then, as a cool breeze swept across the plain, he felt the goose flesh rise on his own arms, and he glanced back. He couldn't see her face, but he could see her arms, wrapped tightly around her own waist. The thin cotton of her dress was useless against the night air. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her own elbows. The realization hit him with the force of an unexpected blow. She wasn't trembling because she was afraid of him, or of the dark. She was trembling because she was freezing. She was exhausted, underfed, and dressed in nothing but a flimsy piece of fabric meant for a daytime ceremony, not a night in the high desert. The shivers racking her body were not from terror, but from simple, physical cold and utter depletion. For the first time in a very long time, Silas felt a pang of something other than his own pain. It wasn't pity, exactly. It was a blunt, practical empathy. He knew what it was to be cold, to be at the end of your rope, to feel your body start to give up even when your mind refused. Her suffering wasn't a matter of emotion. It was a physical fact, as real and as hard as the bullet in his shoulder. He kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead, on the silver ribbon of moonlight that illuminated their path. His jaw was set, his expression unchanged, but with his good hand, he reached behind him to the saddle roll tied at the back. He fumbled for a moment with the leather straps, his fingers clumsy. He pulled free his heavy wool bedroll. Without turning, without a word, he pushed it back towards her. He felt her hesitate for a second. Then her small, cold fingers brushed against his as she took the offered blanket. There was a rustle of fabric as she unwrapped it and draped it around her shaking shoulders. A moment later, the constant, jarring tremor against his back subsided, replaced by the quiet, steady weight of a person simply existing. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. But in the vast, cold silence of the night, a single unspoken message had passed between them. He was not just a means of escape, and she was not just a piece of trouble. They were two strangers, huddled together for warmth on the back of a single horse, riding deeper into the dark. The moon was a sliver of bone in the black sky, offering just enough light to turn the world into a landscape of stark shadows and pale, ghostly shapes. The air had grown colder, thin and sharp in the lungs. For hours, the only sounds had been the plodding of Balthazar's hooves, the creak of leather, and the whisper of the night wind. Then, another sound joined the chorus, the faint, gentle murmur of moving water. Silas felt the horse's gait change, a subtle eagerness entering its step. He didn't need to see the creek. He could smell it on the air, a clean, damp scent that cut through the pervasive dust. He followed the sound, guiding Balthazar through a thicket of willows whose leaves shimmered like silver coins in the moonlight. And there it was, a small, meandering creek, its surface a ribbon of liquid night reflecting the stars. Nestled in a grove of cottonwoods on the far bank was a dark, square shape, a cabin. It was small, barely a shack, and looked as though it had been surrendering to the elements for a long time. The roof sagged in the middle, and the single window was a black, empty eye socket. But it had 4 walls and a roof, which made it a palace in this wilderness. It was shelter. He urged Balthazar through the shallow water, the horse drinking greedily as it walked. On the other side, Silas dismounted, his body a symphony of aches. The fire in his shoulder had settled into a deep, relentless throb. He stood for a moment, letting the world steady itself, his hand resting on the saddle. "We'll stop here for the night," he said, his voice a low rumble. He turned to help Mercy, but she was already moving, sliding awkwardly from the horse's back. Her legs buckled slightly when her feet hit the ground, and she put a hand against Balthazar's flank to steady herself. The wool blanket was still clutched around her shoulders. In the faint light, she looked like a small, lost ghost, her white dress glowing eerily. Silas took the reins and led the horse toward the cabin, his boots crunching on the dry leaves and twigs that littered the ground. Mercy followed a few steps behind, her silence as complete as his own. He tethered Balthazar to a low-hanging branch where the horse could reach the thin grass growing near the creek bank. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard and took the saddlebags, slinging them over his good shoulder. The cabin door hung crookedly on one leather hinge. He pushed it open with his boot, the sound of scraping wood loud and grating. The air that rolled out was stale and musty, thick with the smell of old wood, dust, and the faint scent of animal nests. He stepped inside, his eyes slowly adjusting to the deeper darkness. There wasn't much to see. A single room, a stone hearth black with ancient soot, and a broken chair in the corner. The floor was packed earth, and moonlight streamed through the hole in the roof, illuminating a perfect circle of dust motes dancing in the air. It was abandoned, forgotten, but it was out of the wind. He dropped the saddlebags by the hearth. "It ain't much." "It's enough." Mercy's voice came from the doorway. She stood silhouetted against the night, still clutching the blanket like a shield. Silas worked with the grim efficiency of a man long accustomed to making camp in desolate places. He gathered a few pieces of dry wood from a pile left by some long-gone traveler and used his flint and steel to strike a spark into a small ball of tinder. His left arm was nearly useless, forcing him to do everything one-handed, his movements slow and deliberate. Soon, a tiny flame flickered to life, weak at first, then growing stronger as he carefully fed it small twigs. The fire pushed back the oppressive darkness, filling the small space with a warm, dancing light and the comforting smell of wood smoke. He sat back on his heels, the firelight casting deep shadows across the harsh planes of his face. He watched Mercy, who had finally moved from the doorway to huddle on the far side of the hearth, as far from him as the small cabin would allow. She had placed the blanket on the floor and sat on it, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. She stared into the flames, her face pale and drawn. The firelight found the streaks of dried tears on her cheeks, making them glisten. For a long time, the only sound was the crackle and pop of the fire. Silas felt the exhaustion seeping deep into his bones. The pain in his shoulder was a living thing, gnawing at him. He needed to clean it, to rest, but he couldn't shake the feeling of the girl's presence. She was a question mark sitting in the corner of his temporary world. He pulled a strip of dried beef from his saddlebag and tossed it gently onto the blanket near her. She flinched at the small sound it made. "Eat," he said. It wasn't a request. She looked at the jerky, then at him. Her eyes, pools of shadow in the firelight, were wary, but she picked it up, her movement slow, and began to chew on a small piece with a deliberation that spoke of a hunger she had been ignoring for a long time. He took a piece for himself, his own appetite a dull, distant thing. They ate in silence, two strangers sharing the meager warmth of a fire in a ruined shack, the vast, empty wilderness pressing in on all sides. When she was finished, she carefully folded her hands in her lap, her back straight, as if she were a guest in a parlor. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For the ride? For this?" Silas just nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. He didn't want thanks. Thanks implied a debt, a connection. He wanted this to be a simple transaction, a ride given, a piece of jerky shared, nothing more. But the silence that followed was different. It was expectant. He could feel her story pressing at the edges of the quiet, waiting to be let out. He didn't ask, he didn't want to know, but he knew, with a weary certainty, that he was going to hear it anyway. "I ran away from my wedding," she said, her voice so soft he almost didn't catch it over the crackling fire. He didn't move, didn't look at her. He just kept staring into the fire, giving her nothing. "It was supposed to be this morning," she continued, her voice flat and empty of emotion. "At the church in Dusty Creek. My father, he arranged it." Silas remained silent. A stone wall of a man. He hoped his stillness would be a deterrent, a clear signal that he was not interested. But her need to speak was greater than his desire for silence. It was as if the words themselves were a poison she had to get out. "The man I was to marry, his name is Abner Finch. He owns the dry goods store. He owns most things in that town, one way or another." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "He's not my husband. He was my father's creditor." The words dropped into the quiet cabin like stones into a still pond. Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. He knew this kind of story. He had seen it play out in a dozen different ways in a dozen different hard-luck towns. Men who drank too much, gambled too much, and were left with only one thing of value to settle their accounts. "My father," she said, her voice now holding a tremor of bitterness. "He likes whiskey more than he likes his own family. He'd been running a tab with Mr. Finch for years, a debt for liquor and supplies. It got too big. Mr. Finch came to the house last month. He didn't shout. He was very calm. He just looked around our little homestead, at the broken fence and the dust-choked fields, and then he looked at me." She shivered, though the fire was warm. "I was in the corner, mending a shirt. I felt his eyes on me, not like a man looks at a woman, but like a rancher looks at a horse he's thinking of buying. He looked at my teeth once, just asked me to smile." Silas's hand, resting on his knee, slowly curled into a fist, the knuckles turning white. He thought of his Sarah's smile, a thing so bright and genuine it could have lit up the darkest room. The idea of a man demanding it as an appraisal made something hot and ugly rise in his throat. My father didn't even hesitate. Mercy's voice was barely audible now, a broken whisper. "He and Mr. Finch went outside. I saw them through the window. They didn't talk for long. Then they shook hands. My father came back inside, not looking at me, and poured himself a drink from a fresh bottle mister. Finch had left on the table. That's how I knew. The debt was settled." She fell silent. Silas could hear the soft, ragged sound of her breathing. He risked a glance at her. She was still staring into the fire, but her eyes were glassy, seeing something else entirely, seeing that handshake. "And my mother," she whispered. "My mother just kept kneading her bread dough. She never looked up. She never said a word. Not then, not ever. Her silence was—" It was louder than the handshake. Silas turned his head back to the fire, but he was no longer seeing the flames. He was seeing a different scene. From a lifetime ago, He was seeing a young woman, barely older than the girl across the fire, standing on the porch of a small farmhouse. Her name was Sarah. He had been a young ranch hand, barely making his own way, and he had loved her from the first moment he saw her hanging laundry on a line, her laughter carrying on the wind. But she had been promised to another, her father, a stern, God-fearing man, had arranged her marriage to the son of a neighboring landowner to settle a long-standing dispute over water rights. She was part of the treaty, a piece of property to seal a bargain. Sarah had wept when she told him. She had spoken of her father's unbending will, of her mother's resigned silence, of a future she felt was a cage being built around her. Mercy's story wasn't just a story. It was an echo of the choice Sarah had made. She had chosen him. She had run away with him in the middle of the night, leaving behind her family and the man she was supposed to marry. That man, filled with a bitter, festering rage at the public humiliation, had never forgotten. His family had never forgotten. For years, the grudge had simmered, a low fire waiting for a wind to fan it into a blaze. And it had. The lies about Silas stealing cattle years later, the ones that led to the fire that consumed his home, his wife, his son. Those lies had been planted and nurtured by the family of the man Sarah had been sold to. Her act of defiance, her choice to love him, had, in the end, signed her own death warrant. And he had died in that fire too. The man who walked away was just a shell. He had always believed that he had saved her from that cage. But in his darkest moments, a terrible thought haunted him. What if he had only led her to a different, more terrible one? What if, by choosing him, she had only postponed the inevitable payment for a debt that was never hers to begin with? He was pulled back to the present by a small, choked sob from across the fire. Mercy was crying, her face buried in her hands. It wasn't the loud, desperate weeping of before. It was a quiet, hopeless sound, the sound of a spirit finally breaking. "He's an old man," she wept into her palms. "He smells of stale tobacco and he looks at me. I just couldn't. This morning, I put on the dress because my mother said I had to. But when she turned her back, I just walked out the door. I walked until my shoes broke. And then I ran." Silas sat frozen, a prisoner of his own memories. The girl's words, her tears, were reopening a wound in him he thought had long since scarred over. He saw Sarah's face in the fire, her eyes filled with love and a terrible, misplaced faith that their love could conquer anything. He saw the face of his son, a face he could barely conjure anymore without an agony that threatened to tear him apart. He looked at Mercy, huddled and broken in her dirty white dress. She wasn't just a girl who had run away from a wedding. She was Sarah. Before him, she was a woman who had refused to be a piece of property. But she was alone. She didn't have a foolish young ranch hand to run to. She had only found a wounded, hollowed-out man who knew better than anyone that defying the world's cruel bargains often came at a price too high to pay. He felt a sudden, violent urge to tell her to go back, to tell her that survival was what mattered, that pride was a luxury, that fighting was useless. But the words died in his throat, because he knew he wouldn't have wanted Sarah to go back. Her defiance had been the most beautiful thing about her. It was the thing that had made his life worth living, even if it was also the thing that had destroyed it. He looked at the girl named Mercy, and for the first time he saw her not as a complication or a burden, but as a terrible, painful reflection of his own lost world. He didn't know it, couldn't have put a name to it, but the dead stone in his chest shifted, just a fraction. An old, forgotten instinct stirred within him, not of love, not of hope, but of a fierce, protective anger. The world had tried to break this girl, just as it had broken his, and as he sat there in the ruins of a stranger's home, with the ghost of his wife in the flames, Silas Boone knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was not going to let it happen again. The last of the damp wood hissed and popped in the hearth, a final, sputtering protest before collapsing into a bed of glowing orange embers. The small circle of light it cast shrank, and the darkness that pressed against the cabin's flimsy walls seemed to grow thicker, heavier. With the fire's retreat, the cold advanced, no longer held at bay. It was a sharp, predatory cold that seeped through the gaps in the log walls and slithered across the packed earth floor, carrying with it the deep, profound chill of the high desert night. Silas sat with his back against the rough-hewn stone of the hearth, his rifle lying across his lap. He had not intended to sleep. Sleep was a treacherous country he rarely visited without a fight, a landscape filled with ambushes and ghosts. The throbbing in his shoulder was a faithful sentinel, a constant, grinding pain that kept him tethered to the waking world. The warmth from the dying fire did little to soothe it, but it kept the worst of the shivers at bay. Across the small, shadowed space, Mercy's quiet sobs had long since subsided, replaced by the soft, even rhythm of exhausted sleep. She had cried herself into oblivion, a mercy in itself. She was curled on her side on top of his bedroll, facing the wall, making herself as small and inconspicuous as possible. A single, pale hand was tucked under her cheek, and her dark hair spilled across the rough wool. She looked impossibly young, impossibly fragile. A piece of fine china dropped in the middle of a stampede. He watched her, his face an unreadable mask in the flickering ember light. Her story had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. It had stirred a part of him he had worked for 2 years to kill, a part that could feel the sharp edges of another person's pain. He had built his solitude like a fortress, wall by wall, stone by stone, and this girl, with her quiet defiance and haunted eyes, had slipped through his defenses without even trying. A gust of wind rattled the cabin's crooked door, and a sliver of frigid air sliced through the room. He saw her flinch in her sleep, her body curling tighter, her shoulders beginning to tremble again. The wool of the bedroll she lay upon was a good barrier against the cold ground, but it offered little protection from the icy air. She was still in the thin cotton dress, a garment that was now little more than a dusty, tattered rag. Silas looked down at his own coat. It was heavy sheepskin, the leather cracked and scarred from years of hard use, the wool lining worn smooth in places. It smelled of horse, dust, and wood smoke. It smelled of him. It was his armor against the world, as much a part of his defense as the coat holstered at his side. He thought of the long, cold hours before dawn. He thought of the chill that was already seeping into his own bones. He should do nothing. That was the smart play, the safe play. She was a stranger. He owed her nothing more than the ride and the fire. Getting any more involved was a fool's errand. And yet, he couldn't shake the image of his Sarah, shivering by a campfire on their first night away from her father's house. He had given her his own coat then, wrapping it around her and pulling her close, feeling a fierce, possessive pride in being the one to keep her warm. The memory was a sharp, unexpected pain, different from the dull ache in his shoulder. It was a ghost's touch, and it made him angry. Angry at the memory, angry at the girl for unknowingly summoning it. With a low grunt of frustration, he wrestled with the coat, hissing in a sharp breath as the movement sent a bolt of white-hot fire through his wounded shoulder. For a moment, the cabin tilted, the embers blurring into a smear of orange. He gritted his teeth, his jaw clamped tight until the wave of pain subsided into the familiar, throbbing ache. One-handed, he shrugged the heavy garment off his good shoulder and got to his feet. He stood over her for a moment, a dark, hulking shadow in the dying light. She looked so peaceful in her exhausted sleep, a peace he knew was a lie. He didn't gently place the coat over her. The gesture would have been too tender, too intimate for the chasm of silence and sorrow that separated them. Instead, with a rough, almost dismissive motion, he tossed it. The heavy coat landed over her curled form with a soft thud. It covered her almost completely, a heavy, protective weight. She stirred at the impact, a soft murmur escaping her lips, and then settled again, instinctively burrowing deeper into the sudden warmth. Silas retreated to his spot by the hearth, feeling strangely exposed without the coat's familiar weight. The cold found him immediately, wrapping its tendrils around his arms and back. He ignored it, feeding his own discomfort as a kind of penance for the unwanted flicker of compassion. He picked up his rifle, the cold steel a familiar and reassuring weight in his hands, and resumed his watch. An hour passed. The embers in the hearth faded from orange to a dull, pulsing red. The moonlight streaming through the hole in the roof was now the room's primary source of illumination, painting a silver circle on the floor that moved with agonizing slowness. Outside, the world was utterly silent, as if holding its breath. It started with a whimper, a small, frightened sound, like a lost animal. Silas's head snapped up, his senses instantly on high alert. He scanned the darkness of the cabin, his gaze landing on the mound of his coat. It was moving. She was twitching, her legs kicking feebly against the confining weight of the sheepskin. "No," she breathed, the word a choked, desperate plea. "Please, don't." He remained perfectly still, a statue of stone and shadow. He knew the landscape of nightmares. He had charted its bleak territories every night for 2 years. He recognized the choked cries, the frantic, useless struggle against an enemy that wasn't there. He told himself to stay put. It was her dream, her demons. He had enough of his own to fight. Her struggles grew more violent. She thrashed, her body convulsing under the coat. A sharp, terrified cry escaped her, quickly muffled by the wool. It was a sound of pure terror, a sound that bypassed the fortress around his heart and struck something deep and raw inside him. It was the sound of someone helpless. It was the sound his Sarah might have made in her final moments. He was on his feet before he had even made a conscious decision to move. Every instinct he had cultivated for survival screamed at him to stay back, to not get involved, to let the storm pass. But a deeper, older instinct, one he thought had been burned out of him along with his home, took over. It wasn't the instinct of a lover or a savior. It was the instinct of a protector, a man who had once built a life around keeping his family safe and had failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. He didn't go to her to offer comfort. He didn't know how. The words would have been clumsy and false in his mouth. The gesture of a gentle hand, a grotesque parody of the man he used to be. To touch her, to hold her, would be to cross a line into a world of feeling and connection he could not bear to re-enter. Instead, he crossed the small cabin in 2 silent strides. He didn't lie down beside her. He sat, his back to the hearth, and then lowered himself to the hard earth floor just beside the wool-covered mound she had become. He didn't face her. He faced away, positioning his body between her and the dark, gaping maw of the cabin's doorway. He sat with his rifle resting upright between his knees, his good hand wrapped around the stock. And then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he leaned back until his shoulders and back were pressed firmly against the edge of the bedroll she lay upon. He did not touch her, but she would feel him now. She would feel the solid, unyielding presence of his body, a warm, living barrier against the cold and the darkness. He made himself a wall, a shield of muscle and bone. Her thrashing subsided almost immediately. The frantic energy seemed to seep out of her, as if absorbed by his stillness. She let out a long, shuddering sigh, the sound of a diver finally breaking the surface for air. The nightmare's hold was broken. For a long time, there was only the sound of their breathing in the cold, quiet room. His was slow and measured. Hers was still ragged, catching in her throat, but it was gradually deepening, calming. The rigid terror had left her body, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He felt a slight shift behind him. He didn't move, didn't turn his head. He kept his gaze fixed on the black rectangle of the doorway, his posture that of a guard on duty. Then he felt it, a flicker of movement in his peripheral vision. Her head had turned. He knew, without seeing, that her eyes were open. He could feel her gaze on the side of his face, on his back. He could feel her confusion, her questioning. Slowly, reluctantly, he turned his head. In the faint, silvery moonlight that filtered down from the heavens, their eyes met. There were no words. There were no promises. There was nothing soft or gentle in the exchange. He saw in her eyes a raw, bottomless vulnerability, a flicker of gratitude so profound it was painful to look at. And she saw in his— what did she see? Not kindness, not pity. She saw a grim, resolute stillness. She saw the face of a man who had stared into the abyss so long that it had become a part of him. But she also saw that he had chosen to place himself between her and that abyss, if only for a few hours. The moment stretched, timeless. It was a silent acknowledgement between two survivors, two people running from the wreckage of their lives. An understanding passed between them that had nothing to do with desire, and everything to do with a shared tenancy in the land of the lost. In his silent, rugged presence, she found an anchor in the storm of her fear, in her quiet, desperate need. He found the faintest echo of a purpose he thought he had buried forever. He was the first to look away, turning his gaze back to the door. It was too much. The connection, however fleeting, was a weight he was not prepared to carry. Behind him, he felt her settle. A final, soft sigh escaped her, and her breathing deepened into the slow, peaceful rhythm of true, dreamless sleep. The presence of the wall he had made was enough. Silas did not move. He remained there, a silent sentinel in the dark, his back a barricade against the night. The fire was dead now, nothing but gray ash. The cold was absolute, but for the first time in 2 years, 3 months, and 12 days, he did not feel entirely alone in it, and that, more than anything, was the most terrifying feeling of all. Dawn did not arrive with grace. It seeped into the cabin like dirty water, a thin, gray, and unforgiving light that offered no warmth, only a clearer view of the room's squalor and their own wretchedness. Silas had not moved from his post by the door, his back a rigid wall of defiance against the night, but the defiance was a facade. A fever had taken root in the dark hours, a slow, insidious heat that started in his shoulder and was now spreading through his entire body, making his blood feel thick and sluggish in his veins. The world had taken on a slightly unreal quality, the edges of things shimmering as if seen through intense heat. He watched Mercy stir as the light touched her face. She woke with a small, startled gasp, her eyes wide and for a moment filled with the lingering terror of her dreams. She looked around the grim little cabin, her gaze falling on him. He saw the confusion, the memory of the night before, and then a flicker of something else, a cautious, hesitant gratitude. She pushed his heavy coat off, folding it with a neatness that seemed out of place in their rough surroundings, and placed it on the floor beside him. She didn't speak. He didn't either. The shared look in the dead of night had been an anomaly, a crack in the silence. Morning was a time for rebuilding walls. "The horse needs water," he said, his voice a dry rasp that scraped his throat. The simple act of speaking sent a wave of dizziness over him. Mercy simply nodded and picked up his canteen, her movements quiet and efficient. She slipped out the door, and he was alone with the pounding in his head and the fire in his shoulder. He needed to get up. He needed to check the perimeter, to saddle the horse, to keep moving. To stop was to die. That was the first and only rule he lived by now. He planted his good hand on the dirt floor, his muscles screaming in protest. He pushed himself into a sitting position, a low groan escaping his clenched teeth. The room swayed violently. The floor and ceiling trading places, black spots danced in his vision. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the world to be still. He was a fool. He had known the wound was bad, but he had pushed on, fueled by a stubbornness that had long ago replaced common sense. He had treated his own body with the same reckless disregard he treated everything else. He heard Mercy returning, the soft crunch of her footsteps outside. Pride, that stupid, useless bastard, forced him to try again. He had to be on his feet before she came back in. He could not let her see him like this, weak and broken on the floor of a ruined shack. He set his jaw and pushed upward, trying to get to his knees. It was a mistake. The movement tore something deep inside his shoulder. It wasn't pain, it was an explosion. A supernova of pure agony detonated behind his eyes, wiping out all thought, all sound, all light. The world didn't just tilt, it vanished. The hard-packed earth rose up to meet him, and he surrendered to the rushing, silent blackness without a fight. Mercy stepped through the doorway, the full canteen in her hand, just in time to see him collapse. He didn't fall so much as fold, his body crumpling like a discarded puppet, hitting the floor with a heavy, final-sounding thud. The rifle clattered beside him. For a heartbeat, she was frozen. A wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over her, cold and paralyzing. The wall was gone. The silent, grim protector who had stood between her and the terrors of the night was now a heap of unconscious flesh on the floor. Her first instinct was to run, to flee back out into the wilderness, to take her chances with the emptiness. But then she looked at the empty doorway, at the vast, indifferent landscape stretching beyond it, and she thought of the man she was running from, Abner Finch, with his soft hands and his collector's eyes. She thought of her father's casual cruelty and her mother's suffocating silence. There was no safety out there. There was no one to run to. The fear, so cold and sharp, solidified into something hard and unyielding in the pit of her stomach resolve. The lesson she had learned over years of quiet desperation crystallized into a single, undeniable truth. No one was coming to save her. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling so hard she had to clench them into fists. "Sir," she whispered, touching his good arm. Silas. His name felt strange and intimate on her tongue. He didn't stir. His skin was hot and dry, radiating a feverish heat. She saw the dark, wet stain that had soaked through his shirt and the crude bandage beneath. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the wound was the cause. If she did nothing, the fever would consume him. Panic gave way to a frantic, desperate energy. She had no experience. She had nursed a sick chicken once, helped her mother with poultices for minor cuts. She had never seen a gunshot wound up close, never tended to a man on the edge of death. But she had seen her mother work. She had watched and learned the rhythms of the household, the simple, practical knowledge of survival. First, the fire. She moved to the hearth, her hands now working with a clumsy but determined purpose. She coaxed the embers back to life, adding the last of their wood. Then, water. She took the small pot from his saddlebag, filled it from the canteen, and set it on the edge of the fire to boil. The next part was the hardest. She had to see the wound. Taking a deep breath, she took his knife, a heavy, well-used tool, and carefully, her hand shaking, she cut away the sleeve and the blood-caked fabric of his shirt. The sight made her stomach clench. The makeshift bandage was soaked through with a mixture of old and new blood. The flesh around it was an angry red, swollen and puffy. It was ugly and terrifying, but it was just a wound, a tear in the flesh that needed to be cleaned and closed. She found a clean rag in his saddlebag, dipped it in the hot water, and began to clean the area around the wound. As she worked, her hands still trembling, the silence of the cabin began to feel as oppressive as the darkness of the night before. She needed to fill it, to push it back with the sound of her own voice. She began to talk, not to him, but to herself, to the fire, to the ghosts in the room. "He was my father. He was never a kind man," she whispered, her voice a low, shaky monotone. "But he wasn't always a monster. The drink did that. It hollowed him out, left something else in his place." She paused, wringing out the rag, the steam rising to sting her eyes. There were friends, always friends. Men like him, with dead eyes and thirsty throats. They'd sit at our table and drink his liquor, and he'd expect my mother and me to serve them, to smile. She gently pulled away the blood-soaked plug of cloth he had stuffed into the wound. The hole was deep, ragged. She fought back a wave of nausea and continued her work, her touch surprisingly gentle. "I was 13. There was a man, a trapper named Jebediah. He smelled like sour pelts and stale sweat. He kept looking at me, and my father, he was laughing, telling him I was getting to be a fine-looking thing. He told me to pour Jebediah another glass. I just stood there. I held the bottle, and I just couldn't. The thought of getting any closer to that man, of serving him, of obeying that order, something inside me just broke. I said no." She finished cleaning the wound as best she could. Now came the part she dreaded. In a small leather pouch in his saddlebag, she had found a sewing kit, meant for mending leather and canvas. The needle was thick, the thread was coarse. It would have to do. She threaded the needle with an unsteady hand. It was the first time I had ever said no to him. The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop. The smile fell off my father's face. He looked at me, and his eyes were empty. He stood up, and he walked over to me. He didn't yell. He just raised his hand, and she stopped, her own hand frozen over Silas's shoulder, the needle held aloft. She could feel the sting on her cheek as if it were happening all over again. The sharp, shocking impact, the way her head had snapped to the side, the taste of blood in her mouth. "It wasn't the pain that I remember," she whispered, her voice thick with the memory. "It was the quiet afterward, and the look on my mother's face. She just turned away, back to the sink, and I knew. In that moment, I understood. No one was coming. No one was going to step in. No one would protect me. If I wanted to be safe, if I wanted to survive, I would have to be my own shield, my own wall." Her hand steadied. The trembling stopped. She looked down at the needle, then at the helpless man before her. He had been her wall last night. Now, it was her turn. She took a deep breath and pushed the needle through his flesh. He groaned, a low, animal sound from deep in his chest, and his body tensed, but he did not wake. She worked quickly, her face a mask of concentration. Her stitches were clumsy, uneven, the work of a terrified amateur. But they were strong. They pulled the ragged edges of the wound together, closing the gap. She worked until her fingers were numb and her back ached. Her entire world narrowed to this one, grim task. When she was done, she cleaned the area one last time and bandaged it tightly with the cleanest strip of cloth she could find. Exhausted, she slumped back on her heels, her body drenched in sweat. The fire had burned down to embers again. The sun was high in the sky. She had worked for hours. She spent the rest of the day watching him. She dribbled water between his lips. She bathed his face with a cool, damp rag to fight the fever. And she sat. The silence returned. But it was different now. It was a silence of her own making. A quiet vigil. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, his fever broke. The intense heat of his skin lessened, and his breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, deepened into a more natural rhythm. She felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She had done it. She hadn't let him die. She looked over at his rifle, still lying on the floor where it had fallen. It was a long, heavy piece of steel and wood. She had never fired a gun in her life. She had always been afraid of them, of their noise and their violence. But now, it didn't look like an instrument of death. It looked like a tool for survival. It looked like a wall. She picked it up. It was heavier than she had imagined, awkward in her arms. She carried it to the doorway and sat down, just inside the frame, her back against the rough logs. She rested the gun across her lap, its barrel pointing out into the encroaching twilight. She didn't know how to use it, but anyone approaching would not know that. That is how Silas found her when he finally surfaced from the deep, dark water of his unconsciousness. The first thing he was aware of was the pain, but it had changed. The sharp, tearing agony was gone, replaced by a dull, throbbing ache that felt clean. He felt the tight pull of stitches in his shoulder and the pressure of a fresh bandage. He was lying on his bedroll, his head propped up on his saddlebags. His coat was draped over him. His eyes fluttered open. The world came back into focus slowly, in blurry pieces. The last embers of the fire, the sagging roof, the crooked doorway. And her. She was sitting at the entrance to the cabin, a small, solitary figure against the fading light, and she was holding his rifle. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the world outside, her posture alert, her face set in lines of grim concentration. She was standing guard. He lay there, silent, watching her. The girl in the tattered white dress, the frightened runaway who had cried herself to sleep. She had stitched his body back together and was now guarding him with his own weapon. The wall had crumbled, and in its place, she had built a fortress. He closed his eyes, a strange, unidentifiable feeling stirring in the cold, empty space of his chest. It felt a little like awe and a lot like trouble. They did not leave the cabin for another 2 days. It was a silent, unspoken agreement, a concession to the fever that still clung to Silas like a shroud, and the profound weakness that had settled deep in his bones. He spent most of that time in a state of grim, resentful stillness, his body demanding rest that his mind refused to accept. He watched Mercy move about the small, squalid space with a quiet efficiency that continued to unnerve him. She was no longer just a passenger. She was a partner in this grim business of survival. She changed his bandage each morning. Her touch hesitant at first, then growing more confident, she would boil water, clean the wound with a focus that was absolute, and then bind it again with fresh strips of cloth she had torn from the less soiled parts of her own petticoat. She never spoke during these ministrations, and he never thanked her. The intimacy of the act was a loud enough conversation in itself. It was a transaction of necessity, a debt being repaid, and to put words to it would have made it something more, something neither of them was prepared for. She foraged for food, returning with a handful of bitter roots she had seen the local natives dig, and a cluster of berries she identified with a cautious certainty. She cooked them in the small pot, creating a thin, watery stew that was tasteless but warm, and it was enough to keep the worst of the hunger at bay. He saw the world through the frame of the cabin door, a world in which she moved with a purpose he had not thought her capable of. She was not the fragile girl from the desert. She was a woman whittled down to her very essence, and that essence was proving to be as tough and resilient as desert mesquite. On the morning of the 3rd day, he knew they had to move. His fever was gone, leaving behind a slick of sweat and a draining weakness. But to stay in one place was to invite discovery. Trouble, he knew, had a way of sniffing out stillness. He got to his feet, his legs unsteady, the world tilting for a moment before righting itself. "We're leaving," he announced, his voice still rough. Mercy simply nodded, already gathering their few belonging. The journey north was different now, slower. Silas was forced to ride with a rigid posture, his left arm held stiffly against his body, every jolt of the horse a fresh torment to his shoulder. He could not lift the heavy saddle onto Balthazar's back himself. He had to stand by and watch as Mercy, her face strained with effort, dragged it into place. He instructed her on how to cinch it, his words clipped and impatient, a poor mask for the humiliation he felt at his own helplessness. She listened, her brow furrowed in concentration, and did as he said without complaint. She no longer rode behind him. To have her weight pressing against him, to be so close, was an intimacy he could not tolerate in his weakened state. It felt too much like leaning on her, and Silas Boone leaned on no one. So, she walked. She trailed alongside the horse, her hand often resting on the stirrup leather, her pace steady and tireless. The tattered white dress was now a ruin, stained with dust, blood, and the juices of berries, but she wore it with a strange, unbowed dignity. The landscape began to change as they put more miles behind them. The harsh red rock desert with its skeletal yucca gave way to rolling hills covered in dry, golden grass. Patches of hardy green scrub appeared, and the sky seemed to lose its hard, metallic edge, softening to a deeper, gentler blue. They were leaving the borderlands, the lawless, unforgiving territory where a man's life was worth less than the water in his canteen, and entering a land that at least offered the possibility of life. It was on the second day of this slow, arduous travel that they came upon the meadow. They topped a low rise, and there it was, spreading out before them in a shallow, protected valley. It was a sea of yellow, a vast, improbable carpet of wildflowers, tiny, brilliant blossoms that covered the earth so completely they blotted out the brown of the dirt and the green of the grass. The air was thick with their sweet, slightly dusty scent and the low, contented hum of 1,000 bees. A small, clear stream, the same one they had been following, cut a meandering path through the center of it all. It was a place of such profound and unexpected peace that it felt like a trick, a mirage. Silas pulled Balthazar to a halt, his eyes scanning the perimeter out of pure, ingrained habit. But there was no threat here, only the gentle sway of the flowers in the breeze, the buzz of the bees, and the soft murmur of the water. "We'll rest here," he said, his voice softer than he intended. His body was screaming for a respite from the constant motion of the saddle. He dismounted stiffly, leaning against the horse for a moment as a wave of dizziness washed over him. Mercy was already by the stream, kneeling and splashing the cool, clear water onto her face. She drank from her cupped hands, then looked back at him, a question in her eyes. He gave a curt nod, and she led Balthazar to the water's edge. Silas sank to the ground in the shade of a lone, gnarled oak that stood at the edge of the meadow. He leaned his back against the rough bark, the relief so immense it was almost painful. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, listening to the sounds of this peaceful, impossible place. This was the kind of place Sarah had loved. She would have gathered a handful of the yellow flowers and tucked them into her hair. The thought came unbidden, a sharp, painful splinter, and he pushed it away with a familiar, practiced ruthlessness. When he opened his eyes, Mercy was sitting not far from him. By the bank of the stream, her torn and broken shoes were off, her bare feet dangling just above the water. She was watching something in the tall grass on the other side. She was utterly still. Her posture relaxed for the first time since he had met her. The constant, weary tension that had held her body rigid seemed to have dissolved in the warm, sun-drenched air. He followed her gaze. A ground squirrel, its coat the color of the dry earth, was perched on its hind legs, its tiny paws clutching a seed. It nibbled at its prize, its nose and whiskers twitching with a comical, nervous energy. It was a simple, common sight, a small drama of the natural world that played out 1,000,000 times a day. Mercy smiled. It wasn't the small, tight-lipped expression of gratitude she had sometimes offered. It wasn't the weary, ironic twist of her mouth he had seen in the cabin. This was a real smile. It started in her eyes, a genuine sparkle of light and amusement, and then it spread to her lips, parting them in a soft, unburdened curve. And then, as the squirrel dropped its seed and chittered in frustration before scurrying away, a sound escaped her. A laugh. It was not a loud sound. It was soft, quiet, and a little rusty from disuse, but it was a laugh, as clear and pure as the water flowing in the stream. It was the sound of unthinking, uncomplicated delight, a sound that had no place in the world of blood and fear and running that they had inhabited. It was the sound of the girl she might have been, the girl who had existed before her father's whiskey and Abner Finch's cold eyes. The sound struck Silas like a physical blow. He froze, his breath catching in his chest. He could not remember the last time he had heard a woman laugh. Sarah's laugh had been his favorite sound in the world, a warm, musical thing that he had tried desperately to forget, because remembering it was a torment beyond endurance. Mercy's laugh was different, quieter, more fragile, but it was laughter all the same. It was the sound of life, of a moment of joy snatched from the jaws of despair, and he could not bear it. He turned his head away sharply, his gaze fixing on a distant, uninteresting rock formation. His jaw tightened, the muscles along his neck cording, the smile, the laugh. They were like a sudden, bright light in a dark room where his eyes had long since adjusted to the gloom. It hurt. It was a reminder of everything he had lost, everything he had walled himself away from. It was a dangerous sound, a crack in the armor, a hint of a world he could never return to. But even as he turned away, even as he presented her with his stony, forbidding profile, he could not stop the involuntary softening of his own eyes. The hard, cold flint in their depths receded, just for a fraction of a second, replaced by something ancient and wounded. It was the ghost of the man who had once loved a woman's laugh more than anything. It was a flicker of warmth from a fire he thought had been extinguished forever. He hoped she did not see it. He was certain she had not. But it was there. He sat for a long time, facing away from her, listening to the silence that had fallen once more. When he finally trusted himself to look back, she was no longer watching the stream. She was looking at her own hands, twisting a small yellow flower between her fingers. The smile was gone, her expression once again quiet and contemplative. He looked at her then, really looked at her. The girl in the white dress, the virgin bride, the runaway. He had seen her as a symbol of fragility, a piece of trouble he had been saddled with. But he had been wrong. She was not fragile. She had run for miles through the desert in shoes not meant for walking. She had faced him, a blood-soaked and armed stranger, without pleading or begging. She had survived a night of terror in a cold shack. She had cleaned and stitched his festering wound with no knowledge of how to do so. Her hands shaking, but her will firm. She had stood guard over him with his own rifle. Through it all, she had not complained. She had not whined about the hunger, the cold, the fear, or the exhaustion. She had not asked him for promises or cried for help. She simply endured. She took what the world threw at her and she kept moving, her silence a testament to a strength that ran deeper than he could have possibly imagined. He recognized that quality. It was the same desolate strength that resided in his own soul. It was the quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken, even when everything around you had been shattered. It was the simple, grim act of continuing to exist. The girl in the white dress, who had seemed so breakable, was not breakable at all. She was like him, a survivor, and as they sat there in the silent, sun-drenched meadow, a vast, unspoken space between them, Silas felt a grudging, unfamiliar sense of respect. They were two strangers, two ghosts, but for the first time, he felt as if they were haunting the same ground. The meadow of yellow flowers fell behind them, a fleeting dream of peace in a world that was mostly hard edges and sharp stones. Silas set their course due north, his internal compass fixed on a destination he had not seen in 2 years, a place he had never intended to see again. He did not tell Mercy where they were going. He offered no explanation for the grim, tight-lipped silence that fell over him as the landscape grew more familiar. Each gnarled juniper and strangely shaped butte, a landmark of a dead life. This was his country. Every mile they covered was a mile deeper into the heart of his own personal ghost story. She must have felt the change in him, the way he held himself in the saddle, rigid and unforgiving, his eyes no longer scanning for threats, but looking inward, at wounds far deeper than the one in his shoulder. She walked beside the horse in her usual, quiet way, but she gave him a wider berth, as if sensing the air around him had grown colder, more dangerous. She did not ask questions. She simply watched and waited. They found it late in the afternoon of the next day. They rounded a bend in the trail that cut through a stand of sparse ponderosa pine, and the valley opened up before them. his valley, his land, and there, sitting in the middle of it like a skull bleached by the sun, were the remains of his home. The main house was a ruin, a skeleton. The fire had taken the roof and the floors, leaving only a jagged, blackened stone chimney and a few charred timbers clawing at the sky. The front door was gone, leaving a dark, gaping wound. What had once been a home filled with the scent of baking bread and Sarah's laughter was now a monument to ash and silence, a testament to a world that had ended in smoke. Silas pulled Balthazar to a halt at the edge of the property line, marked by the ghost of a fence, a few rotted posts, and a single strand of rusted wire sagging to the ground. He just sat there in the saddle, a statue carved from dust and memory, his face a mask of granite. He could see it all, not as it was now, but as it had been. He could see his son, Jacob, chasing grasshoppers in the tall grass near the porch. He could see Sarah, her hands dusted with flour, coming to the door to wave to him as he rode in from the range. The memories were so vivid, so sharp. They were a physical pain, a phantom limb that ached with a power the real, living world could not match. Mercy came to stand beside the horse's head, her small hand resting on Balthazar's neck. She looked from the ruin to Silas's face, and her own grew still and solemn. She didn't need to be told what this place was. The desolation spoke for itself. The air was thick with the bitter taste of loss. "This is it," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He dismounted, his movement stiff and automatic. He did not go toward the ruined house. He couldn't. To step across that threshold would be to step back into the fire, and he knew if he did, he would never come out again. To the west of the main house, tucked under the shade of a massive cottonwood tree, stood a small, one-room cabin. It had been his first home here, the one he'd built with his own hands when he and Sarah first claimed this land. They had lived in it for a year while he built the bigger house. Later, it had become a workshop, a storage shed, a place for tack and tools. The fire had not reached it. It stood apart, weathered and neglected, but whole. He gestured toward it with his chin. "We'll stay there." That first evening was a trial of silence. Silas unsaddled Balthazar and set him to graze in the overgrown pasture, his movements mechanical. Mercy, sensing the fragility of the moment, took the saddlebags and walked to the small cabin, pushing open the heavy, plank door. Silas did not follow. He walked to the lone cottonwood that shaded the cabin, the same one where he had buried them. There were no markers, just 2 patches of earth where the grass grew a little differently. He stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, his head bowed, a solitary mourner in a cathedral of ghosts. When he finally went to the cabin, the sun had set and the world was bathed in the soft, gray light of dusk. He found that Mercy had not been idle. She had opened the single window, letting the stale air out. The cabin was a single room, containing a simple rope bed with a straw-ticked mattress in one corner, a small stone hearth, and a rough-hewn table. Dust lay thick on everything, and the corners were draped in cobwebs. Mercy had taken his bedroll and laid it out neatly on the floor. She had not presumed to take the bed for herself. She had found a bucket and was on her way out the door. "The well's out back," he said, his voice flat, probably dry. She just nodded and disappeared into the twilight. He heard the rhythmic, protesting squeal of the old hand pump, a sound he had not heard in years. It was a sound from another lifetime. After a few minutes of dry, grating squeaks, there was a gurgle, a cough, and then the miraculous, life-affirming splash of water hitting the bottom of the bucket. The next morning, the change began. Silas woke on the floor to the sound of movement. He opened his eyes to see Mercy with a piece of his old shirt tied around her hair, a broom fashioned from a bundle of stiff weeds in her hands. She was sweeping. She was sweeping away the dust, the mouse droppings, the dead leaves that had blown in under the door. She was sweeping away 2 years of neglect. He sat up, a protest forming on his lips. He wanted to tell her to stop, to leave it, to let the decay have its victory. This place was a tomb, not a home, but the words wouldn't come. He just watched her, a silent, baffled observer. She worked with a quiet, relentless determination. She swept the floor clean, then took the bucket of well water and a rag and began to scrub the tabletop. She beat the dust from the old straw mattress on the bed, her small frame lost in a cloud of it. She found a rusty pot by the hearth and took it down to the creek to scour it clean with sand and water. She worked without speaking, without looking at him for approval. She was not cleaning for him. She was engaged in a quiet war against the chaos, a solitary battle to impose order on this one small corner of a broken world. It was as if she were tending to a wound, as if by cleaning away the filth and the cobwebs, she could somehow clean away the sorrow that clung to the very air of this place. She was not just sweeping away dirt. She was sweeping away the past, his past, without asking for permission. He felt a strange and unsettling mixture of resentment and something else, something he couldn't name. He should have been angry at her presumption, but he wasn't. He was paralyzed by it, paralyzed by the sight of life and purpose moving through a space he had long ago surrendered to death. He spent the day outside, unable to remain in the cabin while she so thoroughly exorcised its ghosts. He mended the broken section of corral fence, his hands finding the familiar work a small comfort. He used his good arm, his shoulder protesting with every pull of the wire, but the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the turmoil in his mind. All the while, he was aware of her. He could hear the scrape of the bucket, the soft slap of a wet rag against wood, the quiet hum of her presence. In the afternoon, she came to him with 2 tin cups of cool, clear water from the well. He took it without a word. The water was sweet and cold, the taste of home, a taste he had thought he'd never know again. He drank it down, and it felt like it was washing away some of the dust that had settled in his soul. That night, she cooked a small meal of salted pork and beans from his supplies over the newly cleaned hearth. They ate at the scrubbed table, the firelight dancing on the clean-swept floor. The cabin was still a shack, still old and weathered, but it was no longer a tomb. It was just a room, a clean, quiet, simple room. After they ate, Mercy took the straw mattress and dragged it to the corner by the hearth for herself. She gestured to the rope bed. "You should take the bed," she said softly. "Your shoulder needs the rest." He didn't argue. He was tired, a weariness that went deeper than his wound. He lay down on the rope bed, the mattress rustling beneath him. It was the first time he had slept in a bed in 2 years. He stared up at the dark, timbered ceiling, the cabin filled with the soft crackle of the fire and the scent of wood smoke. But he couldn't sleep. The ghosts were louder here, closer. He could almost hear Sarah's voice humming a tune as she worked. He could almost feel the small weight of his son leaning against him as they looked at the stars. He got up and pulled on his boots. He stepped out onto the small, rickety porch, closing the door softly behind him. The night was vast and cold, the sky a spill of brilliant, indifferent stars. He sat on the top step, his forearms resting on his knees, and looked out at the black, skeletal ruin of his house. He sat there, and he listened, and he heard her. He heard the soft rustle as she turned over on the straw mattress. He heard the gentle, even rhythm of her breathing as she fell into a deep and peaceful sleep. It was a sound of life, a sound of simple, uncomplicated existence, happening just a few feet away, on the other side of a thin wooden door. For 2 years, the only sounds in his nights had been the lonely cry of the wind, the distant howl of a coyote, or the frantic, screaming silence of his own nightmares. He had cultivated a deafness to the world of the living, but he could not block out this sound, the soft, steady whisper of a young woman's breath. He sat there on the porch of the past, looking at the wreckage of his life, and listened to the sound of a possible future, a future he had not asked for, had not wanted, and did not know what to do with. Something inside him, something that had been frozen solid for 2 years, shifted. It was a slow, painful, terrifying thaw, the compass needle of his soul, which had pointed unwaveringly toward the bleak, magnetic north of vengeance and death, had begun to tremble. It hadn't found a new direction yet, but for the first time, it was no longer fixed. He didn't understand it. He didn't welcome it, but he could not deny it. It was the slow, terrifying turn of a man who had been steering a course straight into oblivion and had just felt a current pushing him, ever so slightly, toward a shore he never intended to find. And he sat there in the cold, starlit darkness, and he listened to her sleep. The days settled into a strange and quiet rhythm, a routine built on the foundation of unspoken things. The homestead, which had been a monument to Silas's grief, was slowly, almost imperceptibly, becoming something else, a shelter, a place of quiet work and shared silence. The blackened ruin of the main house still stood as a grim sentinel on the landscape, but its shadows seemed to shrink a little with each passing day. Silas's strength returned slowly, begrudgingly. The clean stitches Mercy had made held firm, and the angry fire in his shoulder subsided to a dull, manageable ache. He spent his days in the sun, his hands finding solace in the familiar textures of his old life. He rewrapped the handle of a worn axe, the repetitive motion of the leather cord, a kind of meditation. He sat for hours with a whetstone, drawing a new sharp edge onto neglected tools, the metallic rasp the only sound in the warm afternoon air. He was a man reassembling the broken pieces of a life, not yet knowing if they could ever form a whole again. Mercy, in her quiet way, was the architect of this new piece. She had claimed the domestic sphere of their small world with a gentle but absolute authority. The cabin was kept clean, the hearth swept, their meager supplies managed with a careful parsimony that stretched them further than Silas had thought possible. She had found Sarah's old vegetable patch, a choked and weed-ridden square of earth, and had begun the back-breaking work of reclaiming it. She worked from sunup to sundown, her movements economical and filled with a purpose that seemed to emanate from her very core. She was not just passing time, she was putting down roots, however shallow, in this hard, lonely soil. They rarely spoke. Words were clumsy, dangerous things, capable of disturbing the fragile truce they had established. Instead, they communicated in a language of actions. He would leave a pile of chopped firewood by the cabin door. She would leave a cup of cool water on the porch rail for him. He would mend a broken latch on the stable door. She would mend a tear in his spare shirt with her clumsy but determined stitches. It was a partnership of ghosts, each tending to the needs of the other without acknowledgement, each respecting the other's solitude as if it were a physical boundary. He found himself watching her. He would be oiling a piece of tack, his hands moving automatically, and his eyes would drift to where she was on her knees in the garden, her head bowed, her hands buried in the dark earth. He watched the way the sun caught the stray strands of her dark hair, the determined set of her jaw, the straight, strong line of her back. He had first seen her as a symbol of weakness, a fragile thing in a white dress. Now, he saw a strength in her that humbled him. It was not the hard, brittle strength of a man who had faced the world with violence. It was a quieter, more enduring strength, like that of a river that wears away stone over time not through force, but through persistence. This realization was a constant, low-level irritant, a challenge to the simple, bleak truths upon which he had built his broken world. It was a late afternoon, the kind where the sun hangs low and heavy in the sky, turning the air to liquid gold. The heat of the day had broken, and a soft breeze whispered through the tall grass. Silas was sitting on an old chopping block behind the small, dilapidated stable, running a greasy rag over the metal parts of a bridle. He had spent the morning reinforcing a section of the stable wall, and his shoulder ached with a familiar, satisfying pain. It was the pain of work, not of a wound. Mercy had been clearing the thick, thorny weeds that had grown up against that same back wall. For hours. He had been aware of the soft, rhythmic scrape and pull as she worked, a quiet counterpoint to his own labors. Now, the work was done. A neat pile of uprooted weeds lay wilting in the sun. She wiped her hands on her stained dress, the white fabric now a patchwork of earth tones, and walked over to the well. He watched her pump a bucket of water and drink deeply from the dipper, the cool liquid spilling down her chin and neck, glistening in the golden light. Then, instead of returning to the cabin or the garden, she walked toward him. She moved with a quiet deliberation, her bare feet making almost no sound on the dusty ground. He did not stop his work, but his hands grew still, the rag held motionless over a piece of tarnished silver. She did not sit in front of him, forcing a conversation. She simply came and sat beside him on the long chopping block, close enough that he could feel the faint warmth of her, but not so close as to be touching. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the shadows of the pines stretch and lengthen across the valley floor. The silence was comfortable, familiar, but then he felt a shift in it, a tension. The quiet was no longer empty. It was gathering itself, preparing for the weight of words. "I'm still a maiden," she said. Her voice was so quiet it was almost carried away by the breeze. But the words landed in the space between them with the force of a physical blow. He froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the bridle in his hands, on the intricate pattern of the stitching, on anything but her. It was the most shocking, most intimate thing she could have possibly said. In their world of unspoken rules and guarded distances, she had just laid the core of her identity, the very thing that had defined her flight, at his feet. It was a statement of fact, but it was also a confession, a clarification, a profound act of vulnerability. He could feel the heat rise in his own face, a flush of confusion and a primal, protective anger at her for being so reckless with her own truth. She wasn't looking at him either. Her gaze was directed straight ahead. At the distant, purple hills, her voice, when she spoke again, was just as quiet, but it was laced with a steel he had come to recognize. "But that doesn't mean I don't know who to trust." The words hung there, suspended in the golden air. She had taken her vulnerability and forged it into a statement of judgment, a declaration of faith. She was not offering herself to him. She was telling him that she had weighed him, measured him, and found him worthy of the one thing she had left to give her trust. Silas did not move. He could not. His mind was a maelstrom, a chaotic whirl of protest and a deep, aching sorrow. He wanted to tell her she was a fool, that he was the last man in the world to be trusted. He was a killer, a ghost, a man hollowed out by grief and rage. There was nothing in him worthy of anyone's trust, least of all that of a girl who had seen so little of it in her life. He wanted to stand up and walk away, to put distance between them, to re-establish the safe. Silent boundaries she had just casually obliterated, but his legs would not obey. All the turmoil inside him, all the violent contradictions, all the things he could not say, flowed down his arm and into his right hand. He was still holding the greasy rag, and without conscious thought, his fingers tightened, his knuckles straining against the leather of the bridle, his hand clenching into a fist of such white-knuckled intensity that the bones ached. It was a desperate physical act of restraint. He was holding onto the bridle as if it were the only thing keeping him from either exploding or crumbling into dust. He felt her turn her head to look at him then. He could feel her gaze on his profile, on the hard line of his jaw, on the fist he had made. He imagined she would see the anger, the rejection in the gesture. He hoped she would. He hoped it would be enough to make her retreat, to take back her words and restore the safe. Empty silence. But when she spoke again, her voice was even softer, a near whisper, filled not with fear, but with a quiet, devastating understanding. "You were the first person who stopped," she said. He flinched, the word hitting him with the force of an accusation. He had stopped. It had been his one inexplicable mistake. He should have ridden on. He should have left her to her fate under that rock. His life had been simpler then. Colder, but simpler. She went on. her quiet words systematically dismantling the fortress he had built around himself. "Not because I was pretty," she murmured, and he remembered the way he had seen her. A dirty, tear-streaked face full of defiance. "Not because I was weak," and he thought of her stitching his shoulder, of her standing guard with his rifle. She knew he had not seen her as a helpless damsel. She took a small, shaky breath and delivered the final, fatal blow. "But just because I was a person," the silence that followed was absolute. The breeze died. The world seemed to stop turning. Her words echoed in the hollow chambers of his heart, revealing a truth he had refused to see. He had not stopped for a woman. He had not stopped for a runaway bride. He had stopped because to ride on, to leave another human being to die in the dust, would have been to finally kill the last, lingering ghost of the man he had once been. The man who had loved Sarah. The man who had been a father to Jacob. His one act of compassion had not been for her. It had been a desperate, unconscious attempt to prove to himself that some small part of that man still existed. And she had seen it. This girl, with her old eyes, had looked past the blood and the grit and the coldness, and she had seen that tiny, flickering ember of humanity, and she had called it by its name. He felt something inside him break. It was not a violent shattering, but a slow, grinding fracture, like ice breaking up in a spring thaw. The weight of her trust was immense, terrifying. It was a heavier burden than his grief, because grief was a thing of the past. Trust was a thing of the future. It was a promise, a responsibility, and he, who had run from everything, was now anchored in place by the quiet, unshakable faith of a girl in a ruined white dress. Slowly, painfully, he forced his hand to relax. His fingers uncurled one by one, the tension draining out of them, leaving behind a deep ache. He let the rag in the bridle fall into his lap. He still did not look at her. He couldn't. He was afraid of what she would see in his eyes, and even more afraid of what he might see in hers. After a long moment, he heard a soft rustle of fabric. He felt the warmth of her presence recede as she stood up. She did not say another word. She knew he had no answer to give. With a wisdom that belied her years, she gave him the gift of solitude and walked back toward the cabin, her small figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Silas did not move for a long time. He just sat on the chopping block in the gathering dusk, the weight of her words settling over him, changing everything. He was no longer just a man running from his past. He was now a man someone was trusting with their future, and he had no idea what to do. Trouble did not announce itself with a trumpet. It came as it always did in that country, on horseback, kicking up a column of dust that was visible for miles. Silas saw it first. He was on the porch, running a whetstone along the blade of a skinning knife, the rhythmic scrape a familiar, soothing sound. He stopped, his head lifting, his eyes narrowing toward the trail that wound down into the valley. 3 riders. They were moving at a steady, deliberate pace, not the gait of weary travelers, but of men with a destination and a purpose. A cold knot formed in his gut, a familiar sensation he had learned to trust. He stood up slowly, the knife still in his hand. "Mercy," he said, his voice low but carrying clearly to the garden where she was working. "Go inside. Stay away from the window." She looked up, her face smudged with dirt, a question in her eyes. But she saw the look on his face, the sudden, absolute stillness that had come over him, and she did not argue. She dropped the trowel she was holding, wiped her hands on her dress, and disappeared into the cabin, pulling the heavy door almost shut behind her. Silas laid the knife on the porch rail and picked up the Colt that was never far from his side. He checked the load, the metallic click of the cylinder turning loud in the sudden, watchful silence. He did not holster the weapon. He held it loosely in his right hand, down by his side, and waited. The riders drew closer, their shapes resolving out of the dusty haze. The man in the middle was stout, dressed in dark town clothes that looked out of place and uncomfortable under the afternoon sun. He wore a bowler hat set too precisely on his head, and his face, even from a distance, had a soft, entitled look to it. Silas didn't need to be told who he was. This was Abner Finch. This was the creditor. The men flanking him were of a different breed entirely. They were lean, hard-bitten men, the kind who looked as if they had been born in the saddle. They wore their guns tied low and their hats pulled down to shadow their eyes. They moved with a lazy, reptilian grace that was far more dangerous than Finch's stiff-backed posture. They were hired men, professionals. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from the porch, the animals stamping and blowing in the dust. Abner Finch surveyed the scene with a proprietary air, his gaze taking in the mended corral, the cabin, and finally settling on Silas with a look of mild distaste, as if he were an unexpected piece of vermin. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," Finch said, his voice surprisingly reedy, the voice of a man used to giving orders in a quiet room, not shouting them across a dusty yard. Silas did not move. His eyes flickered from Finch to the two men at his side. The one on the right was lean and wolfish, a cruel smile playing on his lips. The one on the left was heavier, slower, his eyes dull but watchful. The wolf was the dangerous one. "She don't belong to anyone," Silas said, his voice a low, flat rumble that carried an unmistakable note of finality. Finch's piggy eyes narrowed. "I have a contract, an agreement with her father. She is my property, legally and lawfully." The cabin door creaked open, and Mercy stepped out onto the porch. She stood beside Silas, not behind him. Her dress was stained and ragged. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her back was ramrod straight and her chin was high. "I'm not your property, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice clear and steady, though Silas could see the fine tremor in her hands. "And I'm not going with you." Finch's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The public defiance, from the girl he considered a piece of merchandise and this ragged squatter, was an insult he could not abide. He looked away from them, turning his gaze to the wolfish man. "Get her," he ordered, his voice petulant. It happened fast. The wolfish man swung down from his horse before the words were even fully out of Finch's mouth. He moved with a startling, fluid speed, not drawing his gun, but coming straight for the porch. Silas had been expecting a gunfight, a formal, deadly dance. This was something different, a brawl. He shoved Mercy behind him with his good arm and raised the Colt. "Stay back," he warned. The man didn't even slow down. He lunged up the 2 steps of the porch, a long knife suddenly appearing in his hand. Silas fired, but the man was too close, moving too fast. The shot went wide, the bullet thudding into the hard-packed earth. The man crashed into him, the force of the impact slamming Silas back against the rough log wall of the cabin. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded in his shoulder. The newly healed wound, subjected to the brutal impact, tore open. A wave of blackness and nausea washed over him, and his left arm went completely numb, a dead weight at his side. The Colt clattered from his suddenly nerveless right hand. The wolfish man grinned, his teeth yellow. He brought the knife up, but Silas, acting on pure, desperate instinct, drove his knee hard into the man's groin. The man grunted, his eyes widening in pain, and staggered back a step. It was the only opening Silas would get. He shoved himself off the wall, trying to create distance, trying to get to his fallen gun. But the second hired gun had dismounted now. He was slower, more methodical. He simply walked up to Silas and swung the long, heavy barrel of his own pistol in a vicious arc. The blow caught Silas on the side of the head. The world erupted in a shower of brilliant, painful stars, and the ground rushed up to meet him. He landed hard in the dust at the foot of the porch steps, the world a blurry, spinning nightmare. He could hear Finch's reedy voice, triumphant. "There! You see, this is what happens when you defy your betters. Now, bring the girl." Through a haze of pain, Silas saw the wolfish man, recovered now, turned toward Mercy. She was backed against the cabin door, her face a mask of white terror, but there was something else in her eyes. Not surrender. Defiance. The same defiance he had seen when he first found her under the rock. The world seemed to slow down, to move as if through thick molasses. He saw her glance down at his fallen colt, then at the rifle he had left leaning just inside the cabin door. He saw the wolfish man take a step toward her, his knife held loosely in his hand, a look of cruel amusement on his face. He saw Mercy's eyes lock onto the rifle. He tried to move, to shout, to do something, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. His head was filled with a roaring sound, and the dust tasted of blood and defeat. He was helpless, and then he saw it, in a single, desperate motion. Mercy lunged for the doorway, her small hand grabbing the stock of the heavy rifle. She wasn't strong enough to lift it and aim it properly. Instead, she dragged it out, swinging the heavy barrel around. Her body braced against the doorframe. She was clumsy, frightened, but she was not broken. The wolfish man stopped, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "What are you gonna do with that, little girl? You don't even know which end the bullet comes out of." He took another step, and Mercy pulled the trigger. The explosion was deafening in the small yard. The rifle, too powerful for her small frame, kicked back like a mule, slamming her against the doorframe and sending a jolt through her entire body. The shot went wild, the heavy slug tearing a long, splintering gouge out of the stable roof a dozen yards away. It hit no one, but it did something far more important. It stopped everything. The sheer, unexpected violence of the act, the roar of the big gun in the hands of the terrified girl in the ruined white dress, was enough to shatter the hired gun's professional composure. For a single, crucial heartbeat, they were frozen in surprise. The wolfish man took an involuntary step back. The second man, who had been advancing, stopped dead. Even Finch, on his horse, looked momentarily stunned. It was all the time Silas needed. The world snapped back into focus. The roaring in his head subsided, replaced by a single, clarion call to action. He was on his side in the dirt, his vision still blurry, his left arm useless, but his right arm worked. He crawled, his fingers clawing at the dust, closing the few feet to where his colt lay. His hand closed around the familiar wooden grip. He didn't have the strength to get to his feet. He pushed himself up on his elbow, his head swimming. He could see the second gunman, the one who had hit him, turning his attention back, his pistol starting to come up. Silas fired from the ground. The shot was pure instinct, an act of muscle memory from 1,000 desperate moments. The Colt bucked in his hand. The heavy-set gunman grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face. He looked down at the dark, spreading stain on his chest. Then his eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the ground in a boneless heap. The wolfish man cursed and spun around, his knife forgotten, his hand dropping to his own gun. But the shot from the ground had changed the odds. It was no longer a simple matter of intimidating a girl and finishing off a wounded man. And then another sound joined the chaos, the thunderous, unmistakable boom of a heavy-bore shotgun. A pattern of dust and lead shot ripped through the air, catching the wolfish gunman in the side and spinning him around like a top. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and fell, clutching at his ruined side. Silas pushed himself into a sitting position, his head pounding, and looked toward the source of the blast. Standing at the edge of the property, not 30 yards away, was a figure he had not seen in over 2 years. An old man, his back stooped with age but his hands steady, holding a smoking, double-barreled shotgun. Raul, his nearest neighbor from the before times, an old Tejano rancher whose land bordered his own to the south. The sound of the gunfire, the universal language of trouble, had brought him running. Abner Finch stared at the scene, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. The tableau of his easy victory had dissolved into a nightmare of blood and gunpowder. His 2 hired men were down, The squatter was armed. The girl was holding a rifle. And now an old man with a shotgun had appeared as if from the earth itself. He did the only thing a coward could do. He yanked on his horse's reins, pulling the terrified animal around, and spurred it hard, back the way he had come. Raoul leveled the second barrel of the shotgun. "No!" Silas croaked, the word tearing at his raw throat. Raoul hesitated, then lowered the gun. He watched Finch gallop away, a diminishing figure of panic against the horizon. Some men weren't worth the lead. The world fell into a sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded gunmen on the ground and the high, thin ringing in Silas's ears. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gun smoke and the metallic scent of fresh blood. Raoul walked slowly into the yard, his old eyes taking in the scene. He looked at Silas, bloody and dazed in the dirt. He looked at the dead man. He looked at the one writhing by the porch. Then his eyes settled on Mercy. She was still standing in the doorway, braced against the frame, the heavy rifle still held in her trembling hands. The color had drained from her face, leaving it a waxy, translucent white. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the carnage before her, her knuckles white where she gripped the gun. The adrenaline had gone, leaving behind only the stark, brutal reality of what had just happened, what she had done. Silas pushed himself to his feet, swaying, his world a dizzying mess. He ignored his own pain, his own injuries. He stumbled toward the porch, toward her. He reached out with his good hand and gently, very gently, took the rifle from her grasp. She let it go without resistance, her fingers uncurling as if they had been frozen in place. The moment the weight was gone, her body began to shake, a deep, violent tremor that started in her legs and worked its way up through her entire frame. Her face crumpled, the defiant strength finally giving way to the terror and the shock. A single choked sob escaped her lips. He stood there in front of her, the setting sun at his back, a smoking pistol in one hand and the heavy rifle in the other. He was surrounded by the wreckage of the fight, the yard littered with blood and smoke, and the quiet, shuddering sobs of a woman who had refused to be broken. The world returned to him in fragments, like pieces of a broken mirror. First came sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, a gentle, repetitive scrape of wood against wood. Then came smell, wood smoke, the savory scent of simmering broth, and something else, something clean, like lye soap and sun-dried cotton. Finally came feeling the dull, throbbing ache in his shoulder and a deeper, more profound ache in his head, but beneath it all, the unfamiliar sensation of a soft mattress and clean, smooth sheets. He did not open his eyes. For a long time, he simply lay there, adrift in the borderland between the black abyss of unconsciousness and the hard, painful reality of the waking world. He remembered the fight, the explosion of pain as the man crashed into him, the sickening impact of the pistol barrel against his skull, the roar of Mercy's rifle, the taste of blood and dust. He remembered the world dissolving into a screaming, silent darkness. He had been in that darkness for a long time. He had a vague fever dream memory of floating in a sea of fire, of hands, cool and gentle, placing a wet cloth on his forehead. He remembered a deep, comforting voice, heavily accented, speaking in a low mix of Spanish and English. And he remembered another presence, a constant, quiet watchfulness, a shadow that never left his side. Slowly, reluctantly, he forced his eyelids open. The light was soft. The harsh afternoon sun filtered through the cabin's single, grimy window. The room was the same, yet entirely different. It was clean, truly clean. The hearth was swept, the fire burning low and steady under a pot that sent a plume of fragrant steam toward the ceiling. His coat and gun belt were hanging neatly from a peg on the wall. His boots were by the bed, the dust and blood wiped from the leather. Then he saw her. Mercy was sitting in a chair by the window, a solid, mended chair he didn't recognize. She was not idle. In her hands were 2 wooden knitting needles. clicking together with the steady, hypnotic rhythm that had pulled him from the darkness. A ball of gray wool sat in a basket at her feet, and a length of simple, functional knitting, the beginnings of a scarf or a blanket, was growing in her lap. Her hair was no longer the wild, desperate tangle it had been. It was pulled back from her face and tied with a simple piece of string, but stray wisps had escaped to curl around her temples and the nape of her neck. It was the hair of a woman who had been working, not of a girl who had been running. And the dress? The dress was no longer white. It was a pale, mottled gray-brown, the color of river stones and dusty earth. It was clean, but the stains of their journey, his blood, the dirt of the trail, the grime of the cabin were now a permanent part of the fabric. They were not stains anymore. They were a history, a map of where she had been, the symbol of the terrified. Fleeing bride was gone forever, replaced by the simple, practical garment of a survivor. She must have felt his eyes on her, because the clicking of the needles stopped. She looked up, and their gazes met across the quiet room. Her face was thinner than he remembered. The lines of exhaustion around her eyes etched a little deeper, but the fear was gone. In its place was a profound, bone-deep weariness, and something else, a quiet, unshakable strength. He tried to speak, but his throat was a desert, his tongue a piece of dry leather. A harsh, rasping cough was all that came out. She was on her feet in an instant, ladling some of the warm broth from the pot into a tin cup. She came to the bedside and knelt, holding the cup for him. "Easy," she said, her voice soft. She supported his head with her free hand, and he drank. The broth was hot, salty, and life-giving. It was the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. When he was done, she gently lowered his head back to the pillow. "Raoul," he managed to croak, the name a question. He brought the chair. She answered, understanding immediately. And the wool. His wife, Elodie. She brought the sheets. And food. They've been helping." She paused. "The man with the knife. Raoul took him to the sheriff in the next county. He won't be coming back." He nodded, the simple movement an enormous effort, the dead one. He didn't have to ask. A body was a simple problem to solve in this part of the country. He looked at his own shoulder. It was clean, tightly bandaged. He knew, without having to see it, that the wound beneath was healing properly, cared for. "How long?" he asked. 4 days. She said, "You've had a fever. It broke last night." 4 days. 4 days he had been helpless, a dead weight, entirely at her mercy. And she had not run. She had stayed. She had cared for him. She had enlisted the help of a neighbor he hadn't spoken to in years. She had turned this tomb into a sanctuary. They were silent for a long time. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind outside. He watched her, this strange, quiet woman who had stumbled into his life and refused to be a victim. He saw the strength in her, the resilience, the stubborn refusal to be broken. And he saw something else. He saw a future, a possibility. And it terrified him more than any gunfight. She seemed to sense the turmoil in him. She sat back down in the chair, but she did not pick up her knitting. She simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. "This place," he began, his voice still a rough whisper. "It's no place for you. When I'm on my feet, I can take you to a real town, find you work, a place to start over." He was offering her an escape. He was offering her the freedom he thought she must want. He was trying to restore the old order, to make her a stranger again, to set things back on the simple, solitary path he had been on. She looked at him, and her eyes were clear and direct. There was no artifice in her, no feminine wiles, just a simple, devastating honesty. "I don't want to run anymore," she said softly. She leaned forward, her expression earnest, her gaze unwavering. She looked around the small, clean cabin, at the hearth, at the mended furniture, at the bed where he lay. Then she looked back at him. "You are home," she whispered. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. Not the cabin, not the land. Him. A man who had been a ghost for 2 years. A man who had no home, no anchor, no place in the world. She was telling him that he was wrong, that, in his brokenness, in his grim solitude, she had found a place of safety, a place to stop running. He stared at her, his mind reeling. He had no answer. He had nothing to offer her but his ghosts and his pain. He had no future to give. She must have read the conflict on his face, the denial, the fear. She took a deep breath, as if gathering all the courage she possessed. "And if you'll have me," she said, her voice dropping even lower, a fragile, hopeful thread of sound in the quiet room, "I'll stay." It was not a declaration of love. It was not a demand. It was a choice, offered freely. It was a question, laid at his feet, asking for nothing but the right to exist alongside him in this quiet, broken-down place. It was the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to him. All the ghosts of his past rose up in that moment. He saw Sarah's face, smiling, full of a love that had cost her everything. He saw Jacob's small hand tucked in his. The pain was sharp, immediate, a blade twisting in his heart. The old instinct, the instinct to run, to push away, to protect himself from this kind of pain ever again, screamed at him, to say no, to send her away, to be alone again in his safe, cold, empty world. But then he looked at Mercy. He saw the quiet strength in her face, the history of survival in her eyes. He saw the woman who had faced down a killer with a rifle she could barely hold. He saw the woman who had stitched his body and his life back together. She was not a ghost of his past. She was a real, living, breathing fact of his present. And for the first time, the hesitation he felt was not about the past. It was not about the fear of dishonoring a memory. It was about the future. It was the terrifying, heart-stopping fear of a man standing on the edge of a cliff, who has forgotten how to fly but is being asked to trust in the wind. The fear of having something to lose again. Slowly, his right hand, the hand that had known only the feel of a rein, a tool, a gun, moved across the rough wool of the blanket. He reached for her. She watched his hand approach, her breath held in her chest. He extended his fingers, and for the briefest of moments, he hesitated. Then, his hand closed around hers. Her hand was not soft. It was calloused from her work in the garden, the skin rough, the grip surprisingly strong. His own hand was a landscape of scars and old injuries. They were not the hands of a young lover and a delicate maiden. They were the hands of 2 survivors, 2 people who had been tested by the world and had not been found wanting. He did not say a word. He didn't need to. He simply held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. It was an answer, an acceptance, a promise. A single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. But this time, it was not a tear of sorrow. Later, when the sun had set and the world was painted in the soft hues of twilight, he was strong enough to stand. He pulled on his boots, and she stood beside him, together. They walked out onto the small porch and stood side by side, looking out over the valley. The ruin of the old house was a dark, silent shape in the gathering gloom. But beyond it, the fields lay quiet and full of promise under a sky awash with the first stars. The air was still. The wind, which had been a constant, howling companion on their journey, had finally fallen silent. Mercy stood beside him, her hand still in his. The dress she wore, the one that had begun its life as a symbol of a future she had rejected, was now a testament to the life she had chosen. It was no longer a sign of purity surrendered, but of strength discovered. It was the color of the earth she had tilled, the color of the life she had fought for. It was the color of home. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from, so we can all share our thoughts and connect. Please subscribe to my channel. Wild West Stories 1850 like the video. And give it some extra support by hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.